Our header is in place, and we now have a better sense of how to navigate around our app without causing a full page refresh. So let's turn our attention away from the header for a minute and think about our app in general. Thinking back to our mocks, both the header and the landing page should show a list of the available topics that the user can browse images for. As a reminder, these topics are like categories of different images. The list of topics that Imgur provides is not static, so we need to make an API request to get a list of the active topics. That means that we're going to have to request some outside data before we can show any content on our page at all. So this is where Flux and the Fetch library start to come into play. We're going to start this process first of figuring out how to make an API request to Imgur through our app, and then we're going to start to introduce how Flux is going to fit in. So the intent here is we're going to kind of approach this in a little bit more of a naive fashion, or kind of the easy way out, and then we're going to discuss why it's a poor approach, and we're going to start to refactor it towards Flux. And as we do that, we're going to have a lot of discussion about exactly why we are following this different pattern, this Flux pattern. So let's go ahead and get started. Inside of our code editor, we're going to create a new directory, and we're going to call it utils. And inside of utils, we're going to make a file called api.jsx. Note that during this section, there's going to be a couple files that we create that are not going to contain any JSX at all, but we're going to still label them as JSX just for simplicity's sake. So api.jsx is going to serve as our point of contact with Imgur's API. Whenever some part of our application needs to make a request of any kind, they're going to do it through code that we're going to write inside of api.jsx. We're going to centralize all of this request logic because there are two important steps that every request needs to make. And it's just easier to make sure that it all happens in one place so that we don't have to duplicate that code everywhere. So let's go ahead and get started. First thing we're going to do is we're going to install another library called Fetch. Well, this is Fetch essentially. So we'll write npm install -- save, and then we're going to get however you want to pronounce that, I don't know, -fetch. So this Fetch library that we're installing is actually a polyfill for a feature that's currently available in Chrome and a couple of other browsers. If we go over to Chrome and we open our console right here, I'm just going to type in fetch. So this is right here, this is the native fetch function. We have not installed, this is not the library that we just installed. Fetch is like jQuery's Ajax function, but without the jQuery, all the weight of jQuery around it. If you're curious about Fetch, there's a ton of documentation that's very useful to read up on. I highly recommend it. And you can find that at github.com/github/fetch. And this is the polyfill that we actually just installed through npm. And you can see, here's the wg fetch, and below there's some documentation on exactly how to use it. So again, Fetch is native to Chrome and some other browsers, but just to make sure that we've got full support for it in case you at home are using a different browser, we're installing this polyfill just to make sure that it's around. One important side note about Fetch is how React Native fetches all of its data. You don't really use jQuery on React Native. Instead, you'll be making use of Fetch. So if you have any interest in React Native, this is some very directly applicable knowledge that you'll make use of. Okay, anyways, enough of an aside, back to our code. Inside of api.jsx, like I said, we're going to use this as the kicking off point for fetching data from Imgur. So let's go ahead and first we will import fetch. So we'll require wg fetch. And next we're going to save ourselves a little bit of time here. We're going to set a root URL. And this is the root URL to our application, or to our Imgur API. So we're going to write https://api imgur.com. img.get/3. So every single API request that we make is obviously going to have to include this address in it. So by just writing it out once, we're going to save ourselves just a little bit of time. Next, we're going to put down our API key. And I'm going to copy paste in my key. As a reminder, this is your API key that was given to you by Imgur when you signed up for their API. So you might have to log back into their website if you didn't save that code down. Also, as a reminder, keep in mind that if you are saving this repository inside of GitHub, when you push your repo up, if you commit this, the key will be plainly visible to everyone in the wide world. Again, you don't have to pay for Imgur's API. There's really not a lot of chance of abuse there. Just be aware that you are posting up what is essentially some private data. And again, obviously, I'm going to post this key up because, well, I have to show some key, right? Well, anyways. So we're now going to define our global get function for retrieving data from Imgur. So this is going to be the function that is going to be responsible for reaching out to Imgur and grabbing data. So we're going to say we're going to assign just a plain object to module.exports. No need for a React class here. And it's going to have the key get with a value of function. And that's going to take the argument of a URL. And we'll return fetch. And bear with me for a minute here. Let's put some code down and then we'll talk about it. Root URL plus URL. And then we'll do a comma and we'll pass in an object. And inside of this object, we'll pass in headers. And this will have authorization client dash ID with capital ID. And then we'll do a space after the ID. Really important that you get this space here. Don't forget it. Plus API key. All right. So if you recall, the Imgur API requires a header with authorization, client ID, and then your API key. So all we're doing here with this header step is making sure that we're providing the correct authorization. Next, the intended use here, let's describe that really quick, is any other part of our application that wants to fetch data off of Imgur should be able to call just api.get and then images. So when we pass in the string images, it's going to come in as this URL, and then the URL is going to get appended to root URL. So we'll end up with a final URL that looks something like api.imgur.com/3/images. All right, so this is pretty, it's a pretty clean interface that we've got here. So this is looking pretty good. In this next section, let's go ahead and take it for a spin inside of the browser.